What's with the fire, ladies?
I'm not cold.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we get started, I want you to explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
By the way, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them yesterday?
Well, when it dropped below zero last night, I thought it better send Frank out to make a fire for us. And told him not to touch anything except the stove, and well, you know Frank.
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday, when I sent Frank out to Morris Center for that man who went crazy, I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get here from Omaha by today, as long as I went over everything here myself.
Now, Mr. Hale, tell me just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Well, I didn't hear or see anything. Harry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I'd spoken to Wright about it once before, but he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyways, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry, as I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house.
Well, I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, but still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock, so I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say,
Come in.
I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. But I opened the door, this door, and there in that rocker sat Miss Wright.
And what was she doing?
She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked queer.
What do you mean by queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next and kind of done up.
And what was she doing? Oh, and how did she seem to feel about your coming?
Why, I don't think she minded, one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, How do, Miss Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said,
Is it?
And just went on, kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, Can't I see John?
No.
Well, ain't he home, says I.
Yes. He's home.
Then why can't I see him? I asked out of patience.
'Cause he's dead.
Dead, says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but pleating at her apron. Why, where is he, says I. She just pointed upstairs, like that. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here, and then I says, Why, what did he die of?
He died of a rope around his neck.
Well, I went outside and called Harry. I thought I might need help. We went upstairs, and there he was lying.
I'd rather have you go into that stairs so you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked, But Harry, he went up to him, and he said,
No, he's dead all right, and we better not touch anything.
So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting the same way. Has anyone been notified? I asked.
No.
Who did this, Miss Wright?
I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
Weren't you sleeping in the bed with him?
I was sleeping on the inside.
Somebody slipped a rope around his neck and you didn't wake up?
No.
We must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, for after a minute she said,
I sleep sound.
Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said, maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or to the sheriff. So Harry went fast as he could to River's place, where there's a telephone.
And what did she do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner's?
She just sat there with her hands held together and looking down. I got the idea that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I'd come to see if John wanted to put in a telephone. And at that, she started to laugh, and then stopped and looked at me, scared. Well, I don't know about scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon, Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came and Mr. Peters, and I guess that's all I know that you don't.
Well, I guess we'll go upstairs, then out to the barn and around there. You're convinced there's nothing important here? Nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
Oh, here's a nice mess.
Oh, her fruit, it did freeze. She worried about that when the fire go out and it turned so cold. Her jars would break.
Can you beat the woman? Help her murder and worry about her preserves?
And yet, for all their worries, what will we do with that, ladies? Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
To be sure. And yet, I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses that don't have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Loyal to your sex, I see. You and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too.
I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house for more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. But farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson. And then,
Yes?
well, it never seemed a very cheerful place.
No, I shouldn't say it's cheerful. She definitely didn't have the homemaking instinct.
I don't know as Wright had either.
Do you mean they didn't get along?
No, I don't mean anything. I just don't think a place would be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
I'd like to talk more about that later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
Yes, Mrs. Pierce, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
I'd hate to have men coming in my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
Of course, it's only their duty.
Duty's all right. But I guess that deputy sheriff who came in and made the fire might have got a little of this on. Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things all slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry.
She had bread set.
She felt awful bad about all her hard work in the hot weather. Wright was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't belong to the ladies' aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And you just don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. This all you was to take in?
She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose it's just to make her feel more natural. Yes, here it is. And her little shawl that always hung behind the door. There it is.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. And Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in his speech, and he'll make fun of her for saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake up when they were slipping that rope under his neck.
Yes, it was such a funny way to kill a man. Slipping a rope around his neck while he slept, ringing it up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Peters says that coming out of the case was needed a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here. Swipe to here. Sorry. Wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I should hope she had it more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaky. Locking her up in her own town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
I suppose it is.
Well, I hope those men are done sooner than... she was piecing a quilt.
Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
They wonder if she was gonna quilt it or just knot it.
Frank's fire didn't do much up there. Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
I don't know as it's anything so strange. Our taking up our time with little things as we wait for them to find the evidence. I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be done sooner than we think.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Look, this is the one she was working on. Look at the sewing. It's all over the place. Why, it looks like she didn't know what she was about.
What are you doing?
Just taking out a stitch or two. That's not sewed very good. Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch anything, Mrs. Hale.
I'll just finish up this end. Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and some string.
That cupboard, maybe.
Why, here's a bird cage. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Well, I don't know whether or not she did. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, though I don't know if she got one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself.
Seems funny to think of a bird here. What do you suppose came with it?
I suppose maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She had that feeling of around them, afraid of them, that a lot of people have. My cat got into her room one time, and she asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
Why? Look at the door. One hinge is pulled apart.
Looks like someone must have been rough with it.
Why, yes.
I wish if they're gonna find the evidence, they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
I'm awful grateful that you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It'd be lonesome for me to sit here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I had come over when she was here. Minnie Foster. I wish I had.
Well, you were awful busy with your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because I weren't cheerful. And that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is. But I've never liked this place. It's a lonesome place and always was. But I could have come. I can see it now.
Well, you mustn't reapproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. We don't see it with other folks until something comes up.
I wonder how it seemed to never have any children around, and ride out to work all day and no company when he did come in. Did you know Mr. Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink and kept his word as well as most, I guess. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him. Ugh, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. I should think she wanted a bird. What do you suppose went with it?
I don't know unless it got sick and died.
You weren't raised around here, were you? But Mrs. Peters, look at its neck. It's all other side to.
Somebody wrung its neck.
Well, ladies, have you decided she's going to quilt it, or just knot it?
We think she was going to
Knot
knot
it.
it.
Well, that's interesting. Has the bird flown?
We think the cat got it.
Is there a cat?
Well, not now. They leave. They're superstitious.
No sign at all of anyone coming from the outside. They're on rope. Now let's go over it piece by piece. It would have been someone who knew just the location of the bedroom.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, there was a boy, and my kitten, he took a hatchet, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him.
I wouldn't have liked the bird. That thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too.
I know what stillness is. But law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I should have come to visit her. She was Minnie Foster up there in the choir, and she sang, and she had blue ribbons and a white dress. That was a crime not to visit her. That was a crime, Mrs. Peters. Who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I would have known she needed help. I know how things can be for a woman. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together and we live far apart. We go through the same things, just different kinds of the same things. If I was you, I wouldn't tell her her fruit is gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
It's a good thing the men can't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh? Getting all stirred up over a dead canary. They would just laugh.
Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't.
No. Peters, it's all perfectly clear, except the reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, something that would connect up with this strange way of doing it.
Well, I've got the team around. Pretty cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I'm not satisfied that we can't do better. I want to go over everything here myself.
Well, do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
Well, they're not very dangerous things Lisa picked out. And no, Mrs. Peters does need supervising. A sheriff's wife's married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law. Now come here a minute, George. We gotta look at these windows.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
So you enter first. Well, Henry, at least we decided she was not going to quilt it. She was going to... What does he call it, ladies?
We call it knot it, Mr. Henderson.